Stan Lee, the publisher of Marvel Comics, has probably been in the comic book business longer than anybody on Earth. He claims that Guinness is going to put him in the book of records, but that's not really true, is it?
Well, they very well might. You know, as I had mentioned earlier, I think that I've probably written more stories that have been published than anybody who's ever lived. Not necessarily better stories, but certainly more stories. Because for about 30 years, I never wrote less than 2 complete magazines a week. Some weeks I wrote 5 and 6. And just in sheer quantity, I must have been crazy, but for all those years I was grinding it out.
Were you doing the artwork as well as the storyline?
No, just the stories, just the scripts.
It says in the material that I have that you did more than just write comic books.
Oh, well, I was the, of the comic books, I was the editor and the art director also, but I also wrote radio shows, and I did television writing and screenplay writing. You know, I've done everything. As a matter of fact, the first writing job I ever had before I got into comics I thought was the funniest. I was hired as a teenager, I was hired by a news service to write obituaries of people who were still alive, of celebrities, so that when they would die, the obituary is all ready to be printed. Mm-hmm. And after a while I quit because it got so depressing writing about living people in the past tense, you know. Then I got a job writing publicity for a hospital. And I never quite knew what I was supposed to be achieving, whether I was supposed to be trying to convince people that if they got sick, this hospital was a better one to go to than another hospital, or what. I gave that job up. Actually, I had started as an actor. I thought I wanted to be an actor. And in those days, there was just no money in acting, not in little local theaters where I was.
You're talking about the 30s now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I heard of a job open at a comic book publisher, and I figured, well, I think it paid the exorbitant fee of, I don't know, $9 or $10 a week, which was a lot of money to me then. And I took the job, thinking it would be a temporary job, and I've been there ever since.
We're going to find out how you developed into the publisher from just a walk-in employee.
Well, you can't win them all.
Well, we'll find that out in just a few minutes.
Right.
Stan Lee, who is the publisher of Marvel Comics, now the most read comic book group in the world, didn't start out as the publisher. Back in 1939, when he was just a young man, he walked in to find a job.
That's right. I was really a gopher. They hired me to write some copy, do some proofreading, a little bit of editing, and also get coffee for the large staff, which consisted of 2 people, and sweep up the place and so forth. What happened was, shortly thereafter, the 2 people, the editor and staff artist and writer, left. He was a staff artist and writer. They left, and the publisher walked in and saw me there, and he said, "Hey, kid, who are you?" And I said, "I work here." He said, "Well, do you think you can hold down the editor's job until I find somebody else?" I said, "Well, I'll try." And he never found anybody else. As far as I knew, for many years he was still looking, but I stayed as editor all the time.
Earlier, you mentioned that you turned out a minimum of 2 comic books a week, sometimes 3, 4, and 5. You must know now the secret of success in reaching the audience when you do a comic book story. What is it?
Oh, well, I don't know if I should tell. There might be competitors listening, but basically, I guess, you have to... The big thing is the readers of our comic books, and we specialize in superhero fantasy stories, they love to be surprised, and this is really the most difficult thing when you grind out so many stories, but each story has to have an element of something new and something unexpected, you know. And our formula basically is to mix fantasy with realism. In other words, we'll take a character who's got superhuman power. Let's say he can fly through the air, or like Spider-Man, he can climb on walls. We take him and we say, suppose there were such a character and he really existed in the real world. What problems would he have? What would he do if faced with a certain situation? I say, if I had superhuman powers, which is not for a moment to concede that I don't, what would my intents be? And what, for instance, wouldn't I still have to worry about dandruff, or about athlete's foot, or making a living, or having my dates like me, and so forth? Yes. So we take these bigger-than-life characters and we give them very lifelike qualities and problems, and that had never been done in comics before, you see. The heroes had always been just sort of cardboard characters who were always good, virtuous, noble, never worried about money, never had any problems, and they just went out and captured the villain. Our characters are a little different. It's sort of like continuing soap operas month after month, involving, we hope, real people.
You mentioned in here then that the reader can at the same time sympathize, fantasize, and empathize.
Sure, you have a character, again, like Spider-Man, who's got the strength of 25 men and can walk on walls and swing from building to building on his own web, but he still can't go out and chase a villain because his old Aunt May, whom he had lived with at the time, says it's raining out and you might catch cold and you're not wearing a sweater, you better stay home tonight. She doesn't know he's really Spider-Man, you see. And so we have the juxtaposition of the bigger-than-life problem, as I say, and the very simple home life and family life that these characters have, and it makes it, we think, interesting to a reader.
There was a time in the 30s and 40s that the parents looked down at their children for going and buying these, quote, trashy comic books, and we're going to look into that a little deeper when we come back.
Very good.
Comic books haven't always been considered good literature, and I don't suppose they are in the Shakespeare class yet. But comic books are having a use as an educational tool now. And Stan Lee, who is our guest, the publisher of Marvel Comics, is going to tell us about it.
Well, there are many applications and many uses for comics. One of the best and most general, comic books are tremendously useful to start children with good reading habits. Now, by that I mean mostly because of the advent of television, kids just don't read as much as they used to. They're more visually oriented. Many parents have a problem getting their youngsters to do enough reading and to do it voluntarily. A comic book is one of the most effective ways to make a young person realize that reading is fun, it's enjoyable. Once they read comics and like them, they begin to equate printed matter on the pages of a book with enjoyment, and shortly thereafter they go on to read other things. Nobody just reads comic books. If they start as a comic book reader, eventually they go to other things. Comics are also used in remedial reading courses. Marvel Comics, we have many schools where teachers ask us to send 100 issues of each or 1,000 issues of each for their students. And again, youngsters who just don't want to read will voraciously devour Marvel Comics, you see, and the teachers are able to, for instance, we do a book specifically with the Electric Company, that's the sister show of Sesame Street, you know, the Children's Television Workshop.
Yes.
It's called Spidey Super Stories, and this, unlike our regular books, is done specifically for the child who's a slow reader with a very simple vocabulary, and we plan out the use of the dialogue balloons and how we position them so the youngster learns to read from left to right. It is also done so the pictures alone don't tell the story. The youngster has to read the words in order to understand what's happening. We've been doing this for 2 years now. We print hundreds of thousands of these books, and results have shown they've been enormously effective. In fact, one thing I might mention, at Marvel Comics, our regular books, our vocabulary is of college level. If we should want to use a word like proselytize or misanthropic or cataclysmic or what have you, we do.
Yes.
And the children learn what these words mean through their use in the sentence, or even if they go to a dictionary and look something up, that's still good training for them. We haven't lost one young reader through elevating the vocabulary and the style of writing, but we've gained an entire new audience, the college-age reader, you see.
It could be, Stan Lee, that all this started when you were in the Army as one of the few people designated as a playwright, and we're going to find out about that in a moment.
Right.
Stan Lee, the publisher of Marvel Comics, went into the Army and was designated as one of the few Army men who was a playwright. What did that mean?
It's a funny thing. I didn't know this until after the war ended. I looked at my Army discharge, and it said Army occupation. It said playwright. And I did a little research, and I found out there were only 8 others. There was William Saroyan, there was Ivan Goff and Ben Richards, who do the Manic Show on television now, and a few others, Carl Laemmle Jr. And me. I don't know how I got into this select group, because I was quite young, but I had been a writer just before getting into the comics. At any rate, my job was to do training films, and I even did books, instructional manuals, and it was amazing. In those days, I learned how effective comics can be for education. One simple example, they were having a big problem turning out enough finance officers, training them quickly enough. Consequently, the men overseas weren't always getting paid on time because there weren't enough payroll officers to pay them. It was terrible for morale. A guy would be in a foxhole getting shot at all day. Finally, payday came around and his payment was delayed because of the finance situation. So I was asked, could I rewrite the finance textbooks in some way to make the training period shorter? I took the finance textbooks, I rewrote them using comic strips. I created a character called Fiscal Freddy, who was a running character in the books, and I drew the book also. And there were dialogue balloons and there were illustrations. It was almost like an average comic book. Well, through the use of the comic book medium, we were able to shorten the training period for finance officers from 6 months to 6 weeks. In a way, I'd like to think I won the war single-handed. And it was then I realized, hey, this is some powerful method of communication. You can convey a story or information faster, more clearly, and more enjoyably than any other way short of motion pictures or television, which they didn't have in those days. But even a movie isn't as effective a means of education because you have to view the movie at the projection speed. But you can read something at your own speed. If you're slow, you read it slower. If you're fast, you can read it faster. If you want to go back and reread it, if you want to show it to a friend, if you want to carry it around with you, in many ways, comics have an advantage over film, even though film has greater initial impact. So, my long-standing ambition has been to use comics for education, not as well as for entertainment, but in conjunction with entertainment. And at Marvel Comics, we try to do that today. Even in our normal superhero stories, we try for an undercurrent of instructional value also.
When you were in the Army, you used comic books not only to teach the finance officers how to pay the men, but there was a more general use for all the troops.
Oh, sure.
And we're going to find out about that when we come back.
Great. You mean the poster?
Yeah.
Good.
Right. So we want to talk about that.
Ready? Go.
Stan Lee, the publisher of Marvel Comics, was in the Army as one of the few playwrights, a designated playwright, he found out later, with such powerful men as William Saroyan. And during that time, not only did he make comic books that taught finance officers how to be finance officers, but he had a more general poster that affected everybody.
It's a funny thing, one of the problems they had was with venereal disease amongst the troops. And they wanted me to do a poster that would alert the fighting men that if they had been with a lady, they should go to what they called a prophylaxis station as soon as possible thereafter, just to play safe. So I thought, how can I do all of this in one poster and get that idea across? And finally, I used a little cartoon character who was drawn like a soldier, and he was walking into a pro station, so designated by a little green light above the door, and he looked very proud of himself. He was like this, and he was saying, VD, not me. Well, they must have printed 20 billion of these things, and they were all over the world, you know, so that was my big claim to fame.
Oh, that was it?
Yeah.
And after you got out of the Army, you went back to the comic books.
Yeah.
What was your job then?
Well, I was editor, art director, and head writer, and I kept doing that for about 20 more years.
Now, in a day when the Marvel Comics Group publishes more comic books than any other in the world, how many writers do you employ?
Oh, we have quite a few now. We must have between 8 and 12 writers, but we publish about 40 comic books a month. It's funny, it's almost like turning out 40 grade B movies every month, or 40 half-hour situation television adventure shows every month, because the plotting is that involved and that complicated.
And you'd say the copy for a comic book is about comparable to maybe a grade B movie?
Yeah, and I'm being modest, because some of our stories, I think, are even a cut above that. You see, unlike comic books of years ago, we hire the very finest writers obtainable today. We have writers who are ex-professors, who have written television shows, who are science fiction writers, who have written novels. A lot of them have always loved comics, and when they're between books, they enjoy writing comics for us. A lot of them love comics so much that this is their main work, and in their spare time, they do other forms of writing. Some people, I'm really not that way. I have many other interests too, but there are many people working for Marvel that are much more comic freaks even than I am, and I love comics. In fact, I've often thought if Shakespeare and Michelangelo were alive today, it's very possible at some time or other they might collaborate on a comic strip. And wouldn't that be an interesting situation?
Certainly
And
would.
wouldn't anybody admit that the product of their collaboration would be a very worthwhile work of art and literature? And of course, the point I'm making is there is really nothing intrinsically wrong with a comic strip per se. It just depends how well written and how well drawn it is, because it is a viable, most entertaining way of telling a story.
Just a work of fiction with pictures.
Exactly.
We're going to find out some of the characters that you created back in the early 60s, because
Right.
you were the one that brought forth the Marvel Age of Comics, as it was called.
Right.
And we'll check on that in a minute. Back in 1960, Stan Lee, the publisher of Marvel Comics, created the Marvel Group, so to speak, and some characters that were absolutely bigger than life. So the Marvel Age came of age in the 1960s.
The Marvel Age of Comics. Yeah, I guess it all started with the Fantastic Four. That was the first of the new wave of comics.
I have to confess, I don't know who they are.
Well, this is a group of 4 superheroes, and we tried, this is when we really tried to be different and more original than comics had been. So, among the many firsts, in the quartet was a man and his girlfriend, but we didn't just make her a girlfriend who didn't know that he was really the man with the cape, you see. We made them engaged. And in later issues, they got married, and presently they have a child.
Oh, nice.
And they were in love, and they didn't have secret identities.
Yes.
Then there was the obligatory teenage character. Now, I, along with all other red-blooded, normal American people, hate teenagers, which is perfectly natural. Teenagers are, you know, until they become real people, they're horrible.
Absolutely.
So I was not about to make a teenager who would be like Robin is to Batman.
Yes.
See, I've always felt if I were a superhero, I would never run around with some little 14-year-old kid. At the very least, people would talk.
Yes.
You know, I mean, if I were an adult, well, anyway, so we had to have a teenager in the story, but what I did, I made him an itch. I mean, a pest. He was rotten, and he kept saying, hey, I'm not getting enough money to be in this group. I want to cut out, or I don't want to go fight these criminals. I want to play with my motorcycle. And, you know, a real kid. And that's what we tried to do with our characters. And we have another character who's sort of a semi-monster called the Thing. See, what happened, they all went in a rocket ship. They wanted to be the first ones to reach the moon. And the leader of the group, Reed Richards, is a scientist and an inventor, and he created this rocket ship. And they were affected by cosmic rays on their journey to the moon, and they crash-landed back on Earth. And the cosmic rays changed their bodies and gave them superhuman abilities. One of them turned into a misshapen, very powerful, ugly guy. We call him the Thing. And the Thing was always saying things like, I want to cut out of this group because Reed Richards is getting all the glory, and I'm better than he is, and I'm stronger, and why should I take orders from that creep? In other words, I tried to make him typical Americans. They were surly, insolent, resentful, rotten, jealous, greedy, and the audience loved them.
Well, we're going to find out about some more of your characters. For example, Spider-Man, whom we mentioned before, the Hulk, and the Silver Surfer, and Doctor Strange, and of course Captain Marvel himself, and not to mention Captain America and the Submariner.
Right.
Or is it Submariner?
Submariner. You said it right.
Good.
You're one of the few.
Am I glad? We'll be back to talk about those
Right.
in a little while. Want me to wait for your cue, sir?
Yeah, when you found something.
All righty.
Go.
Stan Lee, the publisher of Marvel Comics, has more than one character, and I guess the proliferation of characters is what made the tremendous number, the volume of comic books that you're publishing now, not only in America, but throughout the world. Could you tell us about some of the characters? We've mentioned the Hulk and Spider-Man, and of course the Fantastic Four, which was the beginning back in '60 of these super characters, and the Silver Surfer. But Doctor Strange is the one that interests me as a person who knows nothing about him at all.
Before I leave this studio, you will be so conversant with Doctor Strange, if I can help it. After we had all the other characters, we had the Fantastic Four, then we had Spider-Man, who was a teenager, he's really our most popular one. Then the Hulk, and Thor, the mighty Thor, who's the god of thunder, and on and on. At one point I said, gee, we don't have a magician, and kids are interested in magic. So I thought we would get somebody, and it seemed to me Dr. Strange was a good name for a magician, and we subtitled him The Master of the Mystic Arts. I always like corny, dramatic expressions. And again, in trying to be realistic, not only is he a magician and he wears a cape and he has a mustache, because all dramatic people have to have mustaches, but we decided he'd live in Greenwich Village. And he occasionally walks down the street and he has to watch out about being mugged. And again, it's the juxtaposition of the supernatural with the very mundane, everyday type of existence, you see. Anyway, one of the things about Dr. Strange, he visits other dimensions and he can bring his ectoplasmic self out of his physical body. But he also, as all good magicians must, utters incantations and chants, you see. If he wants something mysterious to happen, something supernatural, he will say, by the crimson bands of Sitterok, so let it be, or by the hoary hordes of Hoggoth, you will vanish. You see, and he has these expressions. Well, what happened was, one time, or many times, when I would lecture at college, kids would get up and they'd say, hey, Stan, we've been doing a lot of research about these incantations that Dr. Strange mumbles, and we have found that they were influenced by ancient Druid writings. Now, come on, fess up. You stole that from the ancient Druids, didn't you?
Did you?
Well, I know about as much about Druidry as I do about brain surgery, you know. I made the expressions up,
yes,
but it made me realize how the readers take these things seriously, and they will look for hidden meanings, and they will look for things that you don't even know are there. It's also very gratifying because it gives you the feeling that however nutty the work you're doing may be, the reader is finding some element of realism and sincerity in it. I can't tell you how many college students do term papers about Dr. Strange's incantations, about the symbolism and the mythology involved in the mighty Thor, who lives in Asgard, home of the Norse gods, about Spider-Man's personal problems and home life, about the religious significance of the Silver Surfer, who we could devote a whole show to the Silver Surfer because there are so many complex and I'd like to think profound elements in the Silver Surfer stories. And I guess even though comics are thought of mainly as a children's medium, I guess I get the biggest kick of knowing that not only do the kids like the books, but in some way we seem able to reach older readers on another level, and the college kids are so much into these comics also.
Marvel Comics have not only an intrinsic value because they have become so part of Americana, but they have a tangible value, and we're going to talk about that when we come back. We're talking to Stan Lee, the publisher of Marvel Comics. And a few minutes ago, we mentioned that Marvel Comics, because they've become a part of America, a part of literature, if you will, and I know that will make some English professors squirm, they have a tangible value. The early Marvel Comics original publications are bringing tremendous dollars. How much?
In the hundreds, and in some rare cases in the thousands. It is absolutely incredible. I would say if someone were knowledgeable in this area, it is probably a much more lucrative hobby to collect comics than stamps, in some cases, than to buy stocks. Because, well, for example, we have one book called Howard the Duck, kind of a crazy new comic we started. It's a serious book. It's
What
about
year?
This little duck. Started last year.
Oh.
This way, or yeah, the end of last year. About a little duck who looks like a duck, wears clothes, smokes a cigar. He just happens to come from a planet where everybody looks like ducks.
Sure.
He got to America. Anyway, the
course.
kids love it. They find a lot of satire in
Yes.
it. I wonder why. And when the book first came out, you couldn't buy a copy because the collectors were running to the newsstands and buying up everything the dealers had available. Within a few months, this book, which originally sold for 25 cents, is now selling for $5, $7, $10, whatever the traffic will bear.
In less than 2 years?
Yeah. Oh, in less than 1 year. In a few months, it has gone from 25 cents to $5 and up. And this is what is happening with comics. Now, not all comics. Howard the Duck is a special situation. But for instance, a first issue of Spider-Man is selling in the hundreds of dollars.
How about Captain Marvel himself?
Same thing. All of those books are that way. You know, you said one thing a moment ago I just want to mention when you said about literature and some professors would squirm. I cannot tell you how many professors teach comic books as part of their contemporary literature courses, or popular culture courses are becoming bigger and bigger. I'm actually an adjunct professor at Bowling Green University,
Yes.
teaching popular literature. This coming spring, I'm going to be teaching a course, a seminar in comics at Yale University, and there are professors all over the country who are friends of mine. There's one author, Asa Berga, at San Francisco State College, who just wrote a book about television, as a matter of fact, who gives big mention to comic books in virtually every book he writes, and has written books about our comic. He wrote a book called The Comic Stripped American, and he considers comic books, as do many professors, as equally as relevant and as important as novels, television, the ballet, opera, or any other form of the media.
It's refreshing to know that, because 20, 30, 40 years from now, as we found, the comic books are a part of today's culture.
Absolutely. And they have a tremendous impact on
Yes.
young people today. They, it's a funny thing. Very often I'll come to stations like this and do interviews, and I can't tell you how many times I've gone, let's say, to a television station, and the cameraman, somebody in his 30s maybe, or late 20s, will walk over to me. It makes me feel very old, but he'll say, "Hey, Stan, gee whiz, I've been reading your stuff since I was 14. Tell me, how's the Hulk doing today?" and so forth. And this wasn't the case many years ago, but somehow with the new type of comics, better written, more relevant, the readers are not leaving the comics or losing their interest as they reach the age of 14, let's say, the way they did years ago. But comics seem to have more of a staying power with people who are picking them up in the past decade or two.
It may be that the writing style is becoming more and more valuable and significant, and that you are using the words that are meaningful.
Well, I certainly hope so.
Stan, thank you very much. Stan Lee, publisher of the Marvel Comics Group.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Okay.
Whew.
Good. Hey, thank you. That was
Oh,
almost
gee,
a marathon, wasn't it?
that was, did that last